Less than 1% of cars on the road today will ever cross 500,000 miles, so I decided to find out exactly what separates that 1% from everyone else. I bought 5 used Japanese cars, all from the same year, all with roughly the same starting mileage, and drove every single one of them as hard and as honestly as a normal owner would for years. 4 of them died. 1 did not. Here is exactly what killed each one, and exactly what the survivor did differently. Number 12. The setup. Nobody else was willing to try 5 cars. Same starting year, same rough starting mileage, all sitting right around 60,000 miles when the experiment began. A Subaru Outback, a Nissan Altima, a Honda Accord, a Mazda 6, and a Toyota Camry. I chose this specific lineup deliberately. 5 different manufacturers, 5 different engine families, 5 different transmission designs, all sold around the same era, all carrying a reasonably solid general reliability reputation on paper. The point was never to set up an unfair fight, it was to give every single car a genuinely fair shot at proving itself over the long haul. Every car got the same basic maintenance budget. Nothing fancy, nothing neglected, just whatever a reasonably attentive owner would actually spend. Oil changes on schedule, nothing skipped on purpose. The goal was never to torture these cars. The goal was to drive them like a normal person would for the next several years and simply pay close attention to what happened. I logged every single repair, every fluid change, every strange noise, and every dollar spent across all 5 cars in the same spreadsheet side by side for direct comparison. Each car also rotated through a similar mix of highway commuting, weekend errands, and the occasional longer road trip, close enough that no single car got an obvious advantage in terms of how it was actually used day to day. What I did not expect was just how early the first car would show cracks. I assumed all 5 would coast comfortably past 100,000 miles without drama. I was wrong almost immediately. Number 11. The first car dies, and it was not even close. The Subaru Outback was the first to go, and it went out exactly the way Subaru forums online had quietly warned me it might. Right around 130,000 miles, the head gasket failed. Coolant started mixing with oil, the temperature gauge crept up on long highway stretches, and within a few weeks what started as a slow weep turned into a genuine overheating problem sitting in a parking lot with steam rolling out from under the hood. Looking back at the maintenance records, there had been a faint hint of trouble nearly 10,000 miles earlier, a slightly sweet smell near the engine bay that I chalked up to a minor coolant top-off, rather than the early warning sign it actually turned out to be. This is a well-documented weakness on certain older Subaru engines. The head gasket material used for years simply was not built to handle the heat cycles these boxer engines produce over time. Repair quotes came back between $1,800 and $2,500 depending on the shop, more than the car itself was realistically worth at that mileage. I had actually read about this exact failure mode before buying the car, tucked away in an owner's forum thread from years earlier, and made peace with the risks going in. Plenty of owners online had successfully nursed their Outbacks past this exact failure point with proactive coolant monitoring, but in this case, the symptoms snowballed faster than I expected once they finally appeared. I made the call to retire it rather than sink more money into a car already showing other signs of age. Car 1 down, 4 to go, but the Outback's death taught me something I was not expecting, and it would matter a lot more once the next car started showing the exact same early symptoms in a completely different engine. Number 10. Car 2 goes down to a transmission. Nobody warned me about the Nissan Altima made it slightly further than the Subaru, limping to around 160,000 miles before the transmission essentially gave up entirely. This was not a sudden, dramatic failure, it was a slow, sickening one. First, a shudder under light acceleration, then a delay between pressing the gas and the car actually responding. Then, on a highway on-ramp one afternoon, the engine revved freely while the car barely picked up speed at all, the unmistakable feeling of a CVT transmission losing its grip on reality. That on-ramp moment is genuinely one of the more unsettling experiences in this entire experiment, merging into highway traffic at what felt like a fraction of the speed everyone else around me was moving, with absolutely no way to coax more acceleration out of an engine that was already revving as hard as it could. Nissan's continuously variable transmissions from this era have a well-known reputation for exactly this kind of failure. The belt and pulley system inside simply wears out faster than a traditional automatic, especially under stop and go city driving and towing conditions it was never really built for. A full transmission replacement quote came back north of $4,000. At that point, with the car already past 160,000 miles and other minor issues piling up, the math simply did not make sense anymore. What made this failure especially frustrating was the dashboard warning system. Right up until the final shudder on that on-ramp, nothing on the instrument cluster suggested anything was seriously wrong. No warning light, no message, nothing beyond the physical sensation of the car simply refusing to cooperate. A transmission fluid flush a year earlier might have bought more time, but by the point any obvious symptoms appeared, the wear inside the unit was already too far along to reverse. 2 cars down, 3 left standing. If you want to see exactly which 2 die next, and which 2 end up fighting it out for the finish line, go ahead and hit subscribe right now, because the next car's death is honestly the one that surprised me the most. Number 9. The uncomfortable pattern. Starting to emerge, 2 cars down, and a pattern was already forming that I genuinely did not want to admit out loud. Both failures so far traced back to a specific, well-known weak point in that particular engine or transmission design. Not random bad luck, not a fluke. These were not mystery failures. They were documented weak points that existed in online forums and owner complaint databases long before I ever bought either car. Independent mechanics in both cases, when asked afterward, said almost the exact same thing. They had seen this exact failure dozens of times before on the same generation of vehicle. That raised an uncomfortable question. If these failure points were known in advance, why did so few owners actually plan around them? The honest answer is most people simply do not research the specific failure modes of their exact engine and transmission combination before buying. They research the brand's general reputation instead, which is not nearly the same thing. A brand's overall reliability reputation is built from averages across dozens of different engines and transmissions, some genuinely bulletproof, some quietly fragile. Buying based on the average tells you almost nothing about the specific car sitting in your driveway. It is worth saying clearly, every single one of these manufacturers also produces engines and transmissions with genuinely excellent long-term track records, including, as it turns out, 2 of the 3 engines still running in this experiment at this point. The failure was never really about the badge on the trunk lid, it was about the specific combination of parts under the hood and whether their known weak points got managed proactively or simply ignored. This pattern would repeat 2 more times before the experiment was over, and the next failure made the pattern impossible to ignore. Number 8. Car 3 dies, and this time, it was entirely preventable. The Honda Accord made it further than either previous casualty, crossing 210,000 miles before finally dying. But unlike the first 2, this death was not about a weak design at all. It was about a missed timing belt. Somewhere around 190,000 miles, I let the scheduled timing belt replacement slip past its recommended interval, telling myself I would get to it the following month. The following month turned into a few more months. Then, pulling out of a parking lot on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday, the belt snapped. There was no dramatic buildup beforehand either. No warning rattle, no dashboard light, nothing that would have tipped off even an attentive owner that the clock was running out. The belt had simply reached the end of its rated life, almost exactly where the manual said it would. On an interference engine, which this particular Accord generation uses, a snapped timing belt means the pistons and valves collide with catastrophic results. The engine was destroyed in the span of about 2 seconds. No warning, no slow decline, just instant and complete failure. This is the death that stung the most, because unlike the Outback or the Altima, there was no design flaw to blame. This was a maintenance interval clearly printed in the owner's manual that simply did not get respected on schedule. The replacement quote for a fresh engine, given how widespread the internal damage turned out to be, landed close to $5,000 once labor was factored in, far more than the roughly $600 timing belt service would have cost if it had simply happened on time. That gap alone, $600 versus $5,000, became one of the clearest illustrations in the entire experiment of how cheap prevention actually is compared to the alternative. 3 cars down. The lesson from this one would echo loudly through everything that happened next. Number 7. Car 4. Dies, and the survivor. Start standing out. The Mazda LS made it to around 230,000 miles before a persistent rattling noise from the timing chain area finally turned into a full chain jump, throwing the engine's timing out of sync and causing serious internal damage. The rattle itself started faint, barely noticeable over road noise at highway speed, only really audible at idle in a quiet parking lot first thing in the morning before the engine had fully warmed up. It grew steadily louder over roughly 6 weeks before the actual failure happened. Certain Mazda engines from this era are known among independent mechanics for timing chain tensioner, where that, left unaddressed, eventually lets the chain skip a tooth on the sprocket. Once that happens, valve timing goes wrong, and the engine essentially destroys itself from the inside within a very short window of driving. I had heard the rattle for weeks before the failure, and genuinely assumed it was something minor, a heat shield, a loose bracket, anything other than what it actually turned out to be. By the time a mechanic diagnosed it correctly, the damage was already done. In hindsight, that rattle was the loudest, clearest warning of any failure in this entire experiment, and it was the one I ignored the longest, simply because it did not sound dramatic enough to take seriously. A 5-minute conversation with a mechanic a month earlier likely would have caught it in time for a tensioner replacement, costing a few $100s instead of an engine replacement costing thousands. 4 cars down. One left standing, the Toyota Camry, now sitting comfortably past 250,000 miles without a single major repair on its record. At this point, I genuinely started wondering if the Camry was simply lucky or if something else was going on entirely. Number 6, the survivor's close call. Nobody saw coming. The Camry was not perfect. It had its own scare, one that very nearly turned it into casualty number 5. Around 280,000 miles, a slow oil leak developed from an aging valve cover gasket, the kind of leak that starts as a faint smell and a small spot on the garage floor, and, if ignored, slowly starves the engine of the oil it needs to survive. This is exactly the kind of issue that, on any of the previous 4 cars, might easily have gone unnoticed for weeks, given how busy life tends to get. A small drip is easy to rationalize away as nothing serious until the dipstick eventually tells a very different story. The difference here was simple. I caught it within the first week, before oil levels ever dropped low enough to cause real damage. A $90 gasket and about an hour of labor fixed the entire problem completely. What made the catch possible was nothing more sophisticated than habit. A quick glance under the car before pulling out of the driveway, a habit picked up years earlier from a mechanic friend who insisted it took less time than checking a phone notification. That same quick glance had caught nothing on dozens of previous mornings, which made it tempting to eventually stop bothering. The one morning it actually mattered turned out to be the one that saved this car's entire future. Compare that $90 fix to the thousands spent burying the previous 4 cars, and the gap in outcomes starts looking less like luck and more like timing. Every single car on this list eventually developed some kind of issue. The only real difference was how quickly each issue got caught and addressed before it turned catastrophic. That difference in response time turned out to be the single biggest factor separating survival from failure, and it shows up again in the very next habit. Number 5, the one habit that mattered more than anything else. If there is one single habit responsible for the Camry crossing the finish line while the other 4 did not, it is this. Every single oil change happened early, never late, and the interval used was shorter than what the manual technically required. Where the other 4 cars got oil changes somewhere close to the recommended interval, the Camry got changed roughly every 5,000 miles, regardless of what the sticker in the windshield suggested, consistently, for over 400,000 miles straight. Fresh oil protects critical internal components from the kind of slow wear that eventually turns into the exact failures that killed every other car on this list. It will not save you from a snapped timing belt or a known transmission weak point, but it dramatically reduces the odds of the slow, cumulative wear that makes everything else worse. Across roughly 450,000 miles, that interval works out to something close to 90 separate oil changes, every one of them logged, dated, and tracked the same way. There is nothing glamorous about that kind of consistency, no single dramatic moment to point to, just the same boring task repeated correctly almost 100 times in a row without skipping. This single habit cost roughly $40 extra per oil change compared to stretching the interval to the maximum. Over 400,000 miles, that adds up to a few $1,000s total, a fraction of what any single one of the 4 failed transmissions or engines cost to replace. Cheap insurance, paid consistently, beats an expensive repair paid once. The next factor mattered almost as much, and it had nothing to do with fluids at all. Skip a single oil change here and there, and nothing dramatic happens immediately, which is exactly why the habit is so easy to let slide over the years. The damage from inconsistency shows up slowly, quietly, and almost always far too late to do anything about it. Number 4, the real cost difference. Once you add it all up, here is the number that actually matters once the experiment wrapped up. Across the 4 cars that died, total repair and replacement costs combined came out to just under $14,000, not counting what was eventually lost, reselling each one for scrap or parts. None of that figure includes the time spent arranging tow trucks, researching replacement quotes, or simply being without a car for days at a stretch while repairs got sorted out, costs that rarely show up on an invoice but absolutely show up in real life. The Camry, across the same rough mileage range, cost just under $4,000 in total maintenance, including that $90 gasket repair and every single oil change along the way. That is a $10,000 gap between the survivor and the 4 casualties combined, and almost none of that gap came from the Camry being a fundamentally cheaper car to own. It came from catching small problems early instead of letting them become large ones, and from respecting maintenance intervals instead of quietly pushing them back a few months at a time. Breaking the $14,000 down further makes the picture even clearer. The Subaru's head gasket alone accounted for roughly $2,000, the Altima's transmission another $4,000, the Accord's destroyed engine close to $5,000, and the Mazda's internal damage rounding out the rest. Every one of those repair bills traced back to a single component that, caught early, would have cost a small fraction of the final number. Spread across the years this experiment ran, that gap works out to real money most owners would genuinely notice missing from their budget. The next factor explains exactly why that gap existed in the first place. Number 3. What the owner actually did differently behind the wheel. Maintenance habits explain part of the story, but driving behavior explains the rest of it. The Camry spent a noticeably higher percentage of its miles on the highway compared to the other 4 cars, which saw heavier stop and go city driving, mixed with short trips that never let the engine fully reach operating temperature. Tracking actual commute patterns across the experiment, the Camry's primary route included a 15-mile stretch of interstate nearly every weekday, while the other 4 cars mostly handled tighter, slower neighborhoods and short errands close to home. Sustained highway driving keeps an engine running at a steady, predictable temperature for extended periods, which reduces the kind of thermal stress that contributes to gasket failures and uneven wear. Short trip heavy driving, the kind 3 of the 4 failed cars saw constantly, puts more stress on an engine through repeated cold starts than most owners ever realize. None of this means city driving destroys a car on its own. Plenty of city-driven cars cross high mileage marks just fine, but combined with everything else on this list, the driving pattern stacked the odds slightly further in the Camry's favor every single day, the same way a small consistent advantage compounds into something significant over hundreds of thousands of miles. Logging actual driving patterns across all 5 cars revealed something else worth mentioning too. The Camry averaged noticeably longer trips overall, closer to 20 minutes per drive compared to roughly 11 minutes for the other 4 combined, giving the engine more time at full operating temperature on a typical day than the others ever got. By this point in the experiment, only 1 car was left standing, and the final stretch to the finish line told its own story. Number 2. The final stretch to 500,000 miles. The last 50,000 miles were honestly anticlimactic in the best possible way. No major repairs. No scares beyond a routine battery replacement and a set of tires that finally wore out from ordinary use. Even the air conditioning, often one of the first systems to need attention on a high-mileage car, kept blowing cold without a single recharge needed across that final stretch, a small detail that somehow felt like the most fitting proof of how little this particular car asked for in return. The transmission, still the original unit, shifted as smoothly at 490,000 miles as it had at 60,000. The engine had never been opened up for anything beyond that single valve cover gasket. Paint had faded, the interior showed honest wear from years of use, but mechanically the car simply refused to give up. Crossing the 500,000 mile mark happened on an unremarkable Tuesday morning, the odometer rolling over during a routine grocery run. No fanfare, no crowd, just a number on a dashboard that 4 other cars never got close to seeing. A mechanic who serviced the car for the final stretch admitted he sees maybe 1 or 2 engines a year reach this point still running on original internal components, and most of those, in his experience, share the exact same pattern this experiment uncovered: consistent fluid changes and problems addressed within days rather than months. If watching one car actually survive an experiment that killed 4 others is the kind of content you want more of, hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps more people see exactly which habits separate a car that dies young from one that crosses 500,000 miles. Number 1. The survivor revealed. In full. The car that survived was the Toyota Camry, and if you guessed it early, you are far from alone. Plenty of people watching probably suspected it the moment the lineup was announced. That instinct is not really a coincidence either. Decades of consistent reputation tend to shape expectations long before any individual car proves anything one way or another. But the real lesson here was never really about which badge survived. The Subaru, the Nissan, the Honda, and the Mazda did not die because they were poorly built cars. They died because of specific, individually addressable weak points combined with maintenance decisions that, in hindsight, were each entirely avoidable. The Camry did not survive purely because Toyota engineering is magic. It survived because every oil change happened early. Every small issue got caught within days instead of months. And the driving pattern happened to favor exactly the kind of sustained, steady operation that keeps an engine healthy over the long run. It is worth being honest about one more thing too. Run this exact same experiment again with a different 5 cars, and there is a real chance a different badge comes out on top, because the underlying factors that actually mattered, oil changes, response time to small problems, and driving pattern have very little to do with which manufacturer's logo sits on the trunk lid, and almost everything to do with the specific habits of whoever is behind the wheel. 500,000 miles is not really a reward for buying the right badge. It is a reward for paying attention consistently, for years, in ways that feel almost boring in the moment, and only look remarkable once you add them all up at the very end. There is no single dramatic decision behind it, just thousands of small, unglamorous ones made correctly, one after another, for longer than most owners ever bother sustaining. 4 cars died, proving exactly what neglect and known weak points eventually cost. 1 car survived, proving exactly what consistency is actually worth. Click the video showing on your left right now, because it breaks down the exact oil, parts, and intervals I used to keep that Camry running for over 400,000 of those 500,000 miles.